Movies can get away with being many things, but no studio wants their latest release to be dismissed as dated and old hat from the moment the first trailer drops. Hollywood wants to constantly be wowing audiences with the newest hotness, because nothing dents a movie's box office like the general population thinking it looks quaint, corny, and just plain old behind the times. But every so often, a series of miscalculations conspire to deliver a film that feels totally out of time, like it somehow traveled through a cinematic wormhole and wound up in cinemas years after its intended bow. I'm Ewan, you're watching What Culture, and here are 10 movies that felt instantly out of date. Number 10, The Internship. Remember The Internship? Yeah, this glorified feature-length product placement for Google, starring Vince Vaughn and Owen Wilson as middle-aged salesmen who take internships at the tech giant, couldn't feel more mid-2000s if it tried. Except it came out in 2013, a fact The Onion made hilarious light of by dubbing it, quote, the biggest comedy of 2005. Actually, that'll sound even better in the old movie trailer voices we used to get. The biggest comedy of 2005. Indeed, given that in 2013, the internet wasn't quite the mysterious dial-up connection beast to middle-aged folk that it was in the early to mid-2000s, The Internship felt like a dusty relic the moment it was announced. Between the poor reviews and mediocre box office, it's easy to see how this project probably would have done gangbusters had it released between 2003 and 2006, back when the general population was considerably less tech literate, pre-smartphones and all, and Vaughn and Wilson were at the peaks of their fame. Number 9, Black Widow. Ever since Natasha Romanoff, aka Black Widow, played by Scarlett Johansson, was first introduced to the Marvel Cinematic Universe in 2010's Iron Man 2, fans assumed it was just a mere matter of time before the character got her own spin-off. Though it was often suggested that Marvel Studios was anxious about greenlighting a female-led superhero film given the prior failures of projects like Catwoman and Elektra, there was certainly considerable fan interest in seeing Black Widow get her own Bourne-style spy thriller. And it finally happened in 2021. But the big problem? Black Widow had died 2 years prior in Avengers Endgame, and so the film was forced to be a prequel side story that took place primarily after Captain America Civil War. To be clear, Marvel had just released the most climactic superhero film to date, followed it up by going backwards. By 2021, a Black Widow movie felt like a quaint afterthought, closing the cinematic door after the horse had bolted, or rather yeeted itself off the Vormir Mountains. Given that Romanoff's fate was already known and Endgame had quite decisively shut the book on the character, a common criticism of Black Widow was that it should have been made about 5 years earlier when Natasha was still, alive. Number 8, Gemini Man. For all of its attempts to push filmmaking quote-unquote forward by being filmed at 120 frames per second in 3D, Ang Lee's Gemini Man feels like a sci-fi thriller that tripped and fell straight out of 1997. And that's because, in a sense, it did. The pitch for Gemini Man first started doing the rounds in Hollywood in 1997. After which a number of actors flirted with starring in it, including Harrison Ford, Sean Connery, Nicolas Cage, and Clint Eastwood. It ultimately didn't start shooting until decades later in 2018, with Lee directing Will Smith in the dual role of an assassin and his younger clone, achieved here with cutting-edge visual effects tech. And yet, despite this, the chintzy assassin fights himself premise and the particulars of the script would have felt right at home in your typical mid-90s bargain bin VHS rental. This one just happened to have an $138 million budget and no Jean-Claude Van Damme, which is a huge loss in my opinion. As a fitting addendum to the whole matter though, Lee recently confirmed that he won't be shooting films in 3D or high frame rate ever again, and honestly, thank God. Number 7, Crash. 2004. It's incredibly telling that race relations drama Crash had its origins in 1991, when writer and director Paul Haggis was the victim of a carjacking by two black men in Los Angeles. This prompted Haggis to develop his film about racial and social tensions in LA, as was eventually released in 2005 and controversially went on to win the Best Picture Oscar, pipping easy favorite Brokeback Mountain to the post. While Crash is often derided today as one of the all-time weakest Best Picture winners, even back in 2005, it felt like a simplistic engagement with its subject matter. A sort of heavy-handed message movie that regularly won Oscars and tore up the box office throughout the 1980s and 90s. In a year where Crash was up against not just Brokeback, but terrific films like Capote, Good Night and Good Luck, and Munich, its award success felt even more like a puzzling throwback to a bygone era. Number 6. Clerks III. Kevin Smith's long-awaited Clerks threequel didn't merely feel a bit passé because it once again saw the filmmaker peering back over his shoulder to consider his past, but also because it featured a jokey subplot centered around NFTs. Yeah, I mean, I forgot these things existed again, so I'm not happy with being reminded that they were a thing. Smith, who is enough of a proponent of NFTs that he even released a movie, Kilroy Was Here, exclusively as one, has Elias, played by Trevor Furman, and his friend Blockchain, played by Austin Zajur, trying to sell NFT kites throughout Clerks 3. Now, even if the mere mention of non-fungible tokens doesn't make you groan, this movie came out in September 2022, at a point where NFTs had already peaked in popularity and were dying on the vine. By 2023, the majority of them had become totally worthless, which I'm sure is still keeping Seth Green up at night. Seriously, anyone, if you've seen his apes, let him know, because he was super upset about that. Number 5. The Little Things. Despite starring 3 Oscar winners in Denzel Washington, Jared Leto, and Rami Malek, only one of whom actually deserves to have any Oscars, The Little Things came and went in 2021 without much of a peep. And it can't solely be blamed on Warner Bros.' decision to send it to HBO Max the very same day it hit cinemas. Also, for clarity's sake, I'm talking about Denzel Washington. He deserves all the Oscars in the world, but Jared Leto and Rami Malek? No. Anyway, one common sentiment among reviews of The Little Things was that the crime thriller felt like a straight-faced throwback to the 1990s, where modest thrillers about serial killers routinely made bank at the box office off the back of their lead actors. Think of something like Kiss the Girls or Along Came a Spider, that kind of thing. As such, it's little surprise to learn that writer and director John Lee Hancock penned the first draft of the script way back in 1993, shortly after the Silence of the Lambs' astronomical success prompted everyone in Hollywood to get to work on their own copycat projects. Though Steven Spielberg, Clint Eastwood, Warren Beatty, and Danny DeVito all considered directing at various points, it ultimately fell to Hancock himself to resurrect the project almost 30 years later and get it made. It's certainly not a bad movie, all things considered. It's just one that fails to stand out in an era where commanding audience interest is more challenging than ever before, and star power has never meant less to the general moviegoer. If you saw The Little Things airing on cable while channel surfing in 1998 though, oh, you probably would have had a great time. Number 4. Jason Bourne. The Bourne movies came along and redefined the spy genre in the early 2000s, starting with Doug Liman's The Bourne Identity, before the series was passed to Paul Shaky Cam Is My True Love Greengrass with The Bourne Supremacy and The Bourne Ultimatum. Soon enough, the Matt Damon-led series spawned a host of imitators, clearly providing the visual and tonal blueprint for Martin Campbell's brilliant James Bond reboot, Casino Royale. Bourne had concluded pretty definitively in 2007 with Ultimatum. We watched as Jason uncovered his past and took down Treadstone, and left the cinema to the sounds of Moby, well and truly satisfied with the film as a trilogy capper. And then there was a spin-off. A fairly decent film in and of itself, directed by Michael Clayton's Tony Gilroy, but attempts at franchising Bourne still felt contrived. A feeling that wasn't shaken when it was announced that Greengrass and Damon would be returning for a follow-up to Ultimatum called Jason Bourne, which released in 2016, almost a full decade after the previous film. The fourth mainline Bourne film stood out as dated as soon as it dropped, with Greengrass deploying all the same tools from the preceding efforts, but with no thematic or emotional impetus for it to land. It felt like an unnecessary addition when it was announced, and remained that way when it was released. Number 3. Morbius. Oh, Morbius. Even accepting that every entry into Sony's Spider-Man universe to date has given off a pronounced whiff of the early 2000s, none of them feel quite as aggressively insta-aged as Morbius. Morbius feels like it comes from a small pocket of time for superhero movies between 2003 and 2005. A Daredevil-adjacent kind of film where they could still be thoroughly naff and yet still have something of a pop culture imprint. And beyond this, its slick vampiric action seemed of a piece with the Underworld franchise, which itself launched back in 2003. Toss in Tyrese Gibson as a wisecracking comic relief cop, and it's easy to look at the film, released in 2022 as it was, and twice, and ask yourself, what year is it? Number 2. The Core. Without checking, just try and guess what year sci-fi disaster film The Core came out in. 1995? 1996? Maybe 1997? Nope. 2003. With its hilariously loony premise of a drill team racing to detonate nuclear weapons to restart the rotation of the Earth's core, hell yeah! This is a film that, in its very bones, feels like it's riding the coattails of countless 1990s disaster flicks like Independence Day, Armageddon, Deep Impact, Daylight, Dante's Peak, Volcano, and so on. Oh, and also let me know which one of those movies is your favorite down in the comments below. I'm always gonna be riding or dying for Independence Day, because that thing, that is a real movie. But back to The Core, and with the most late 90s / early 2000s cast imaginable, including Aaron Eckhart, Hilary Swank, Delroy Lindo, Stanley Tucci, DJ Qualls, Richard Jenkins, Bruce Greenwood, and Alfred Woodward, accompanied by some hilariously wretched CGI, even for its release year, The Core felt like a film Paramount just left in their studio vault for a few years by accident. And yeah, though the disaster genre was still incredibly popular at this point in time, The Day After Tomorrow grossed over $500 million in 2004, just a year later, The Core was a colossal box office flop, its innate datedness seemingly deterring paying moviegoers from checking it out. And number 1, Bloodshot. It feels like Vin Diesel's superhero flick Bloodshot came out at least a decade ago, when in fact, it was released just 4 years back in 2020. Now, we can't solely blame this on Bloodshot being one of the last major Hollywood movies to release before the time-warping pandemic, but also because it seems precisely like the sort of high-concept nonsense Diesel would have starred in from the early 2000s through to the 2010s. Take Diesel's schlockier star vehicles from that era, The Chronicles of Riddick, Babylon AD, and more recently, The Last Witch Hunter, and Bloodshot sits very comfortably among them, perhaps fitting given that the comic source material launched all the way back in 1992. Except this movie was filmed in 2018 and released with visual effects which looked at least a solid decade behind the times, if not even more. Bloodshot feels like it comes from a time when Hollywood was still embarrassed of superhero movies. And so, in light of the huge artistic strides the genre has made over the last 15 years, it's almost hilariously quaint to sit through.